Hi, everyone. It's Carlin here. As we approached Valentine's Day, Elaine and I found ourselves reflecting on a movement that's reshaping how many women view love, relationships, and their place in society. It's the 4B movement, if you haven't heard about it. It emerged in South Korea during the mid 2010s as a reaction to gender inequality and represents the 4 deliberate choices, the 4 no's, or the 4 B's in Korean: no marriage, no childbirth, no dating, and no sex. The movement is leaderless. It has no central headquarters or official manifesto. It's just thousands of women, many anonymous, sharing their experiences and supporting each other's choices. Elaine and I, over the past few months, have watched the 4B gain traction in the US. We are, let's call us, intrigued. And the movement isn't without its complexities and concerns, so today we'll explore both 4B itself and relate it back to our own experiences with modern love. Again, I'm Carlin.
And I'm Elaine. Welcome back to our podcast, Related.
All right, Elaine, I have been really excited to talk about this with you. I know that you also have been more aware of this movement for longer than I have.
Yeah.
And so I'm so curious from your vantage, why does 4B exist? What does it represent? And what does it bring up for you personally? That's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions.
But I figured it was a good place to start.
Yeah. So, like you said, I've been aware of it for a while. I would say, so I've been watching K-dramas for like 3 or 4 years now, pretty not religiously, but it's like been, if I'm looking for a show, I'm going to look for a South Korean show first.
Yeah.
And part of that for me has been figuring out the culture because it is so different than ours.
Yeah.
And I think why the 4B movement is interesting to me is because I can really see how it comes out of their culture itself. There's a lot of expectations put on women in Korea, along with the assumption that you're going to get a high paying job. There's a lot of status that's associated with that. And then the gender roles have not changed as much. So you're being forced into a workforce that is really not accepting of women. And very similar to here, but maybe even more so. I've never actually experienced it, so I can't say that it's worse, but the rigor and the formality, I think, makes it even perhaps harder to navigate.
Yep.
I haven't been watching K-dramas that long, but it has definitely become...
You're an aficionado.
I'm an aficionado.
You are the person I go to when I need K-drama recommendations.
Yeah, and I also go on Reddit and message boards reading about like the K-dramas I watch, because sometimes there are cultural things that I don't understand and I kind of want to dig into it a little bit. And the 4B is part of the vocabulary when discussing especially women in the workplace and women in relationships.
Yep. And it's so interesting because it was really only a few months ago when I was doing my, brief 1 month, 2 month stint on TikTok where I started feeling aware of it because I was suddenly seeing a bunch of not Korean women, mostly US women with hashtag 4B movement, especially in light of the Trump election, talking about it. And I was intrigued. I was a little surprised that I hadn't heard about it yet because it feels both... I don't know. I don't know that it's mainstream. Would you call it mainstream?
I would not call it mainstream. Like you said, it's not centrally organized, so it doesn't have that same organizational power that movements do. It's really like a self-identifying thing.
It feels very, if you know, in some ways. It doesn't feel like it's more broadly hit the masses, or that the masses are broadly aware of it. That was at least the feeling I got,
I think that's
maybe.
right. I think that's the feeling in South Korea, but I also think that it probably made its way here via K-pop and K-dramas. And
Yep.
so a lot of the people who first started identifying with it were people like me who are Korean media fans.
Yep.
And so it didn't come in through like the normal news network or something. It kind of seeped in through the culture.
Yep. I'm so curious because this is something that I've been thinking about myself is what does it say also about US society now that it's starting to pick up traction here? And what does it mean to you on a personal level? I think for example, on my end, I read somewhere, and I wrote this down, that it's a statement about autonomy and choosing oneself in a world that often demands women choose others first.
Mhm.
And I've been reading and thinking a lot about just this concept of kind of decentering men, I think in general, in a very often patriarchal world. And I would
Mhm.
say we are in a
Yes.
broligarchy, world right
Yes.
now. I actually hate
Yes.
that term broligarchy, but I'll flag it just because it's a term that's being thrown out in the media right now. So yeah, I think it had me feeling really reflective, and I think a little bit introspective on frankly my own feelings around dating, around just being a woman in
Yeah.
society right now, and I'm curious what it brought up for you.
Do you mind repeating that quote? The quote you said at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. I need to figure out where I found it. It could honestly be just a chat GPT articulation of the 4B movement, to be honest, if I'm being really honest. But it's a statement about autonomy,
Yeah.
about choosing oneself in a world that often demands women choose others first.
Yeah. So the reason I asked you to restate that is I think that there is something about that invokes this like personal choice
Yep.
in a world where often choices are made for us or they're expected of us.
Hmm.
Like the default is that you will date, that you will get married, that you will have sex, and that you will have kids. Um,
Yeah. And also just that you have sex to have kids
right,
too.
right. And that in South Korea and growing here, that you will also continue to go to work and be disrespected and deal with
Yeah.
the bullshit on that side while continuing to do these things that are the hallmarks of womanhood.
Hmm.
And I think it offers a choice. It's saying you can maybe step away from that. And I can see the appeal in that.
Yeah. On a frankly more personal level, single, I'm dating. I think what's really interesting for me is I have in the past 10, 15 years dated quite a bit. In the past few months in particular, I have not been dating. I think it's a little bit of combined app digital fatigue, and finding that when life is centered around maybe not men, but those choices, which often do therefore center around men, I end up feeling really
Mhm.
exhausted. And I think what it brings up for me personally is just the fact that I'm late 30s, single, frankly often feel like a salmon swimming upstream in a society that expects that I should be married and have kids, and more important, want to be married and have kids. And that is increasingly doesn't feel like it's maybe the path for me. When I hear about the 4B movement, on the one hand, it feels very extreme to me because I also really enjoy men and I enjoy romance. But I also really value my own independence and equality and not carrying the mental and emotional load for someone else.
Yeah. I also think to me, the 4B movement is a lot about saying, and this is getting to a little of what perhaps you were getting at, but not that these women don't enjoy this interaction with men, but are saying, for whatever reason, the men that we're seeing, our values just don't align.
Mm-hmm.
And if our values don't align, how can we really have a partnership?
Yeah.
So my view of the 4B movement is not that this is women that like have never dated, are not interested in men.
Yeah.
This is women who have been out in the dating pool and are saying there's something here where the values that I am finding important in my life are not aligning with the values that men are finding important. And so
Mm.
I'm not finding them attractive as a life partner. And maybe that's reciprocal. Maybe I
Yeah.
putting myself out there and men are not finding the values that I have attractive.
Yeah.
And there's this separation that really it's just not worth the effort perhaps
Yeah.
of trying to overcome.
Ooh, I think that feels really true. Just what you're saying is we're at this weird place right now in time where perhaps women are, or some women are moving in one direction and men are either still clinging to older expectations or potentially moving another direction. There's a distinction between, like, there's so many good men, right, too, in the world, and
Absolutely.
a lot of really good, like, kind, empathetic men. And I will also say, I also don't know, and this maybe sort of gets into another question I had, which is around, like, is the trend helpful or is it harmful? Like, in some ways, even if you were to be, for example, with a really kind man, like empathetic man, and I think about my last real relationship where, I mean, he's amazing. I think the world of him. And like fast forward now, I think that even if you are, I guess what I'm trying to say is, even if you are with a kind, empathetic man, there's like still things that women take on that are independent of a man that they're partnering with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
articulating that well? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are two things that you said. I keep doing this.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I love it.
The first thing is you were talking about the separation and you were talking about women now. And there's a disconnect between how women of our generation were raised and how men of our generation were
Yes.
raised. I think women of our generation were raised to be more independent than our mothers.
Yeah.
And men of our generation were raised maybe more empathetic, but similarly to how our fathers were raised. And when you have a generation that is looking for basically the role that their mothers fulfilled
Mm-hmm.
from a generation that has not been programmed in the same way, then I think there's naturally a disconnect.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm
And also when we live in a society that, independent of who you're with, there are still like cultural and societal expectations that you're raised with. Because I would
no, and
say
I
I
think that
agree with
bears
you.
on
Yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't think I don't want to come along as judgy. I don't think there's a right and a wrong way to raise your kids. I just think that there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
and and I think it'll be interesting to see how our kids grow up. Is that disconnect getting larger? Is it getting smaller? Is it the same? Like
Mm-hmm.
and also who's making the compromise? Are we raising our children to be our daughters to be equally independent or less independent? Are we
Mm-hmm.
raising our boys to be more independent or more into like equal partnership? Like how are we
Yeah.
raising the next generation to see how that gap either
Yeah.
fills or doesn't? I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
The
And
second
I guess
thing,
I Just to quickly,
Yeah.
before you move to the second point, I think what that brings up for me, though, is this tension that I personally struggle with, which is, yes, I think in our case, for example, mom and dad raised us to be quite independent and strong and well educated and, yeah, opinionated also too. But I also simultaneously, I don't think it was really until my 20s after watching, many Disney movies and playing house as kids and things where I was like, wait. Society is telling me that my goal in life should be Prince Charming mom of, two kids, white picket fence. And yes, I agree with everything you're saying, but I also feel like we're of the generation where maybe some of that, it was a transition. I am feeling personally a tension and some of the maybe misalignment of having maybe more progressive parents, for example, in terms of the independence and what women were doing 50 years ago. Does
Yeah.
that feel right to you? Yeah.
Yeah. And that leads me to my second point actually, which
Yeah.
is the 4B choice. I'm calling it a choice here, not a movement.
Yeah.
Is it a micro or macro thing? Is it a personal choice that you make because
Mm.
this is just where your life is? Like,
Yeah.
or is it something where you recruit other people because you're trying to make a statement? Like,
Hmm.
are you trying to change something?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, let's take a break
Yeah.
and return to that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, Elaine, so you just said something that I thought was really important, which was, is 4B a personal choice, something that you just do and maybe relate to and support one another's who are doing, or is it truly a movement to make a stand, to make change in broader society? So I would love to continue that train of thought
Yeah.
because I've never heard it articulated that way, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something about labeling something, like giving it a name. 4B makes it more relatable. And I think that there are probably a lot of women who wanted to make this kind of choice, but didn't have a name for it or
Yeah,
weren't sure how to frame it and saw this. And I think this is part of why it caught on a bit in the last year in the US since Roe v. Wade and Trump's reelection and a lot of the, rollbacks on women's rights.
yeah,
It gives it a name, and suddenly you're not like the old spinster woman who's, like, upset with the world.
yeah. Embittered,
There's
embittered, burdened, like, yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right. There's something attractive about saying, "No, this is, like, a choice I've made."
yeah,
So I think on a personal level, there's, like, just a attractiveness of having a name for something that reflects a choice you've made in your life.
yeah.
And on the other hand, when you use that name, are you recruiting other people to
Mm,
your choice? Are you trying to collect enough people that you invoke a social change? Are you saying that enough women are not partaking of the institution of marriage, of dating, of sex, of children? Are you collecting enough people that you're saying the status quo is not acceptable right now?
yeah,
Um, and we need to change
hmm,
as a society.
yeah,
And I think those are two very different approaches on the same framework.
yeah. And I would argue, based on everything that I have understood and read and digested on 4B, is that it originated maybe as more of the latter. And especially how I've seen it start to manifest in the US, I see it in conversation with, for example, Trump or the Roe v. Wade overturning is okay, US society is not supporting women, so kind of fuck men, we're gonna 4B. That's sort of how
I
I've been reading it. You disagree?
I definitely think it's been a rallying call, but the people that I think have used it more are the people who were already detached from the dating
Mm,
thing.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, like, I don't think hearing 4B made anybody make a different choice than they were gonna make.
Yeah.
I think it just gave a name to a lot of women who were feeling dejected, rejected, were in the dating game and we're just not finding partners for whatever reason. I don't think it's like they were lacking in some way. I think there's just a lot of things that go into finding a partner. But
Yeah.
when your values don't align, I can see just detaching completely. And then coming across this 4B, reading an article on Reddit, seeing that other women are also having this dilemma
Yeah.
and you know, getting behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. I it also brings up, I don't know the answer to this, maybe you do, is 4B something that you commit to for the rest of your life, or is it something that maybe you sit in and live within for a few years, for example? Or yeah, is it something that you have to commit to for the rest of your life, or is it something that can be more temporary?
I think you approach it how you want to approach it. If you're
Yeah.
saying, I can't do it right now, like the
Yeah.
next year, I want to focus on my career, and
Yeah.
this is like, or there could be women who I've just said, this is not the direction. This is not the direction.
Yeah.
I'm going
Yeah.
in a completely other direction. And
Yeah.
I think it can be, I think it can be both. And I don't want to co opt the South Korean like conversation
Totally.
around this.
Yeah.
But I think having the decentralized organization allows for people to give their own definitions to this kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, well then I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Would you 4B? Would you ever call yourself 4B? And if so, why? And if not, why not? I'm also happy to answer first, but I want to hear.
Yeah. So I have probably been for being I don't know what the for a while. I have dated in the past, but have never really found the process fun
Yeah.
or compelling or maybe it's because I'm lacking and men don't find me fulfilling of what they're expecting about the dating process. But I haven't clicked with the process.
Yeah. I like that articulation.
And I think a lot of it, you know, I will go on a rant about online dating for forever. And how I think it's the worst. So I haven't it hasn't been something like I'm fond of doing and
Yeah.
I have detached from it.
Yeah.
Would I call it for being? No.
Mm,
I think for me, framing it as a personal choice, I don't I don't know where my life's going to be in 2 years.
yeah.
I don't know where my life's going to be in 10 years. I don't For me, I like being open to the evolution of my life
Yeah.
and putting a label on it, whether it's temporary or permanent, cuts off possibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is just not something I'm willing to do, especially since on a macro level, I'm not sure that it's making the statement that people want it to make. I don't think that there are enough people behind it. I think there are a lot of women who are still dating, who are still having sex, who are still having kids.
Yeah.
And so to make the statement, I'm not sure it moves the needle any. I think if it moved the needle somewhat, maybe I would 4B
Yeah. Yeah.
in name.
Yeah.
Um but currently I don't see enough movement behind it to actually affect change. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
but it seems very isolated at the moment. Would you 4B?
I don't think so. It's interesting because when I first saw it, I think there were aspects of it that made me feel like I was able to see myself in a contingent of women who were not just going down the typical path that society expects them to, which I really frankly appreciated. And I think, again, as an unmarried, no kids, late 30s woman, it's really nice to feel maybe a little bit more in community with other women who are making similar choices, even if they're not the exact same ones. But there is something about 4B that makes it feel more anti-men and maybe a little bit more radical than I would buy into. I don't know. I'm, like thinking of one person in particular whom I've dated, and also just thinking unromantically about dad or Strand, our brother. There are really good, kind, empathetic, thoughtful men out there. So to just be like, no men at all
Mhm.
just feels so extreme and maybe a little bit.
I think it's, like, somewhat
Yeah, I was gonna
productive
say, I was like, shouldn't we be
because
figuring out how to, like,
out how to
meet? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like, shouldn't we be inviting them to the
Yeah,
conversation, not
yeah.
denying them all
Totally, just being
access?
like, "No, no." Yeah, I think that's the part about it that feels hard for me, and I will also say the other thing too that has come up a little bit in conversation with others around 4B, or just, in perusing the Reddit threads, is all the stuff that it brings up around what about male allyship, or where do trans women fit into this as well too? Is there
Yeah.
are some it can feel a little exclusionary by a subset of 4Bers, which I don't love at all.
Yeah, yeah. I've actually when you first sent around the articles, I was thinking you sent them around with the "Is it harmful or is it helpful?" question,
Yeah.
and I for some reason, my mind kept going to the women's protest in Iceland,
Mm,
which was women basically taking a day off. And unlike South Korea, Iceland is like number one in gender parity. And I think the difference with the Iceland movement is that it is more organized, it is more approachable. They've got a set goal, they've got set actions.
mhm.
It's like very manageable.
Yeah.
And I think part of
And also
4B
probably,
is
I'm assuming, allows more women to participate in it, right?
allows more women to
Yeah.
participate in it. Yeah. Mostly because it's just like one day.
Yeah.
It's like one day off.
And doesn't also dictate that in order to be using 4B as the foil here. If 4B, for example, dictates that in order to be part, let's say, you
Yeah.
have to make those four choices, from what it sounds like in Iceland, you don't need to have made those choices. All you have to do is sort of say, hey, something's not working in society right now, whether that's the mental load for kids or pay gap at work or whatnot, and show up for a day or not show up
For
for
a
a
day.
day.
And
Right.
and
Yeah.
and the other thing about it is honestly, I'd have to do a bigger deep dive into it, but I think that there were also provisions for people who couldn't participate to show
Yeah.
their support.
Yeah.
Like if you couldn't get childcare, there was a way to indicate that you were behind it so that
Yeah.
you could also have varying levels of buy-in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think having that like concrete message and action, you can affect more on a social scale,
Yeah.
which is why I think to some extent 4B is ineffective while also being counterproductive.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, I want to make the distinction because I think it's effective maybe in some community building among
Mhm.
women, more from a personal trust
On a more
perspective.
micro scale, yeah.
Yeah.
On a more micro
Yeah.
scale, I can see how naming it,
Yeah. Yeah. But I
yeah.
also don't think, yeah, to your point, it solves the larger systemic issues. And if I think about some of the women in my life who I love dearly, who are married, who do have children also are like exhausted because the US has an awful childcare system, or so there are just so many other reasons. And, like that exhaustion is part of the reason where I'm like, oh, having kids just seems really hard, right? Like, so it doesn't, it would be really interesting to see what it would or could look like if, I don't know, if you kind of took some of the 4B sentiment and then took more of a, frankly, more inclusive approach that addresses, frankly, just a lot more of what women in general, thinking about
Yeah.
the US in particular, are feeling right now, and
Yeah.
rallied around that in a more inclusive way.
Yeah. Though, and I don't want to end on a sad note,
Yeah.
but I think part of why, and I keep coming back to it, the
Yep.
Icelandic women's strike was effective is that everybody participated. Like,
Yep.
really, it
Yeah.
was everybody.
Yep.
And I'm just not sure we have that coalition in the US. I
Yep.
mean, when you talk about the people who voted for Trump, you always hear about a certain group of women. So I'm just not sure we have that coalition to affect the change that perhaps I think is required.
Yeah, I will say, and I feel like this is a perfect segue into the next topic we want to talk about, is I do wonder, just given where this manliness trend and culture that has come up with the oligarchs, Zuckerberg and his gold chain, Elon Musk, and
Oh
this sort of like
God.
very frankly anti-woman sentiment
Yeah.
that is starting to feel really pervasive, if perhaps that will, the silver lining of it could be perhaps there does end up being a bit more of a rallying cry and a coalition builder for women in the US. Maybe that's my optimistic thinking, but
You're optimistic. I'm
I'm
glad someone's optimistic.
yeah, I'm optimistic. I don't know. It's interesting. I just feel like I've been having more honest and frank conversations with my female friends of all types in a way that maybe it's just a token of our age. And because I do think our mid to late 30s and early 40s are a really transformational time for women,
Yeah.
there is like big change happening right now in a way that we can't, I feel like a lot of us feel out of control right now. And I do feel in some ways reaching out more and more to female driven community and find that others are reaching for it too. So maybe there's something there.
I hope so. I just worried about the bubble effect
Yeah. Yeah.
because I've also been having these conversations, but these conversations have been happening for
Yeah.
20 years
Yeah.
and yet somehow women keep proving me wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, again, I feel maybe more optimistic. You feel maybe a little bit more pessimistic, and we'll kind of have to see where it goes.
Yeah.
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 And so next time, we wanted to dig in a little bit more into this trend around manliness and the so-called manosphere. Do you want to
Yeah.
elaborate?
Well,
Yeah.
I think the 4B, while maybe not as powerful, does have a counterpart in the manosphere. So we'll be talking about that.
Amazing. All right. We're going to end on a lighter note. We're going to bring back for the second time, but maybe hopefully not the last time, our stranger shout out segment, which, just as a refresher for our faithful listeners, is where we give a shout out to someone out in the world who has moved us, affected us, done some good or a little deed that made us feel a little spark of joy or kindness or connection in this crazy world. So, Elaine, stranger shout out.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording, but I went to a organizing meeting over the weekend. With all the things that have been going on, I felt like I needed to step up in a way. My stranger shout out is to all the people who attended, because It gave me a feeling of not aloneness, which is really valuable at this time. But I think just other people stepping up and saying, we feel the same way as you is really powerful.
Yeah. Similar in terms of feeling in community with others, but on a very, very different note. I want to give a stranger shout out to the Reddit thread for the Severance season 2 TV show. And also, frankly, to Ben Stiller, who's maybe not a stranger to some, but certainly a stranger to me, for creating Severance, because I am loving the first 4 episodes of this season so far. They are riveting. I have watched every episode, and then I go into the Reddit thread where all of you theorists and conspiracists are jotting down all your thoughts and details, and then I go back and watch the episode, and honestly, it's a little bit of light and escapism in this, again, crazy world, and I am so grateful to you all for it. Thank you.
You sound like me and my K-dramas. I need to go to the message boards.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed our conversation this week, we look forward to sharing more with you.
Follow us now so that when our next episode premieres in 2 weeks, you can be sure not to miss it. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
See you next time, everyone.